Okay, clothing recycling. What the heck is it? How does it work? As if single stream recycling wasn't already confusing enough, now we have some of the most greenwashed brands in the world encouraging us to consider this mass overconsumption of unnecessary fashion pieces and then justifying it with recycling. Sounds familiar? I've been getting sent so many of these clothing recycling programs in my DMs, in my comment sections. I really love that so many people who watch my videos also pick up on the bullshit. That is marketing, greenwashing, all of those sort of things. So I just had a feeling that a lot, not all, but a lot of these clothing recycling programs were just downright bullshit. So today I want to examine some of the claims made by those brands so that we understand what clothing recycling is and then how we can actually do it right to solve a lot of the issues within the fashion world, within the fashion industry, if you will. Let's see if it can be a solution to the 11.3 million tons of textiles that go to landfill every year. I actually got to go behind the scenes of an actual clothing recycling facility thanks to SmartWool. SmartWool is one of only 3 brands who have let me behind the scenes at their manufacturing facilities. So I feel like to get to the point where you allow me behind the scenes, you have to have an epic level of transparency. And after going through this whole process with SmartWool, seeing their clothing recycling program, I have to say the transparency is top tier, God tier. Remember when I used to do those ranking videos? I'd put SmartWool in God tier, hands down. So we can go in order of showing the people that are doing things that are wrong and then showing them how it should be done. We'll do it that way. The reason that curbside and single stream recycling hasn't really been a solution is because it doesn't address the root of the problem, which is really overproduction. When we talk about clothing recycling, to me the biggest problem of clothing recycling is that we're focusing on this side of the supply chain and never ever on this side of the supply chain, which is an overproduction, a massive overproduction of textiles and goods that really are unnecessary in the grand scheme of things. Because if you're recycling clothing, but you're producing new clothing faster than you can even recycle it in general, that's a problem. If you're exploiting people along the way, but then touting yourself as sustainable because you recycle, that's a problem. If you spend more money marketing your recycling program than you do on bettering your supply chain in terms of ethics and sustainability, that doesn't sit right with me. That's a problem. And if your biggest marketing push is how much of clothing you've taken in to be recycled, but never show us exactly what that recycling is being turned into, I'm giving you side eye, bombastic side eye. I feel like I've talked about on this channel for years how my main concern when we talk about sustainability are people with privilege who have the ability to not support these problematic industries, and how we can do so by shopping secondhand, stop lining their pockets with our money. And to me, if we continue to do all of those things to create a demand for more and more and more production, that supply chain will never be sustainable. We're ignoring all of the energy used in the manufacturing process. We're ignoring all of the outputs of the manufacturing process. We're ignoring the pollutants and the solvents in the water, all of those things, and just saying, well, we're gonna recycle it, so it'll be fine. Recycling in its best form, if we're actually having a circular system, a circular economy, which is the goal of recycling, you would turn this thing back into essentially an equal product. Recycling would be taking a plastic bottle, turning it back into a plastic bottle. But if you're taking clothing that was produced horribly and has all the issues we've already gone over, and then you turn it into insulation, well, you're still gonna be producing mass amounts of clothing. You're not solving the problem that you're creating. Does that make sense? And we're missing the whole circle from a lot of these greenwashing brands who promote clothing recycling as a solution to the problem that they're not really addressing. Now, I want to say that I'm really excited to talk about SmartWool's clothing recycling program because their program is in complete contrast to all of the issues I just outlined. Aside from the information they share on their website, I think allowing people who are quite well known on the internet to call out a brand when they're doing something that is greenwashy, if you let that person into your facility to see the actual process, I think that's a level of transparency that only a few brands, like I said, in the world have. As I said, I think the biggest problem when we talk about why clothing recycling isn't a solution is only focusing on the end of supply chain and never thinking about what happens before the end of your supply chain. Because in reality, if we talk about how you're sourcing materials, how you're manufacturing materials, how far it's being shipped all over the world, is there textile waste from making the garment? Are you polluting by using more water? All the sort of things that lead to environmental footprints along the supply chain. If we consider each section of that supply chain, the smallest footprint a lot of times is the end of the product's life cycle. That's something that SmartWool did not do. They did not just skip all of these things and go to this final step. Let me tell you about all the things I learned that they did in their supply chain before getting to this part. As the name SmartWool probably suggests, they primarily use wool in their products. Their flagship sock was made of wool, right? Makes sense. So SmartWool has really taken, again, God-tier initiatives. SmartWool specifically has one of the highest certifications for merino wool that you can get, which is called ZQ certified wool. But my point is that they didn't skip that part of the supply chain, which is the first step. And a lot of times that is actually where the biggest environmental footprint comes from when we're talking about a product. And that's what you should be looking for when you hear clothing recycling. The first thing you should ask or think of is this the first thing they did to find a solution, or is it closer to being one of the end parts of their supply chain that they're taking a look at? So taking material sourcing into consideration is really important. What's the next step in the process would be manufacturing. When we're talking about fashion, there are so many ways that it can result in waste. And one of the ways that I think people don't think about as often is simply the way you cut a garment. So I did ask about how they have special techniques that lead to less waste than traditional cut and sew methods. And when you take these things into consideration, you're creating an actually sustainable, a supply chain that can be sustained long term. That's why it's important to me. I would ask questions about things and they would say, oh yes, we're working on that, but it's not public yet because we don't like to talk about things before we've achieved them. And that's something that I personally do in my own life too.
I don't like to speak of things before they're finished, but it's so far a masterpiece, if I do say so myself.
And their goals are actually much higher than a lot of brands that you know, because we're hearing a lot about carbon neutrality, right? Within the next 10, 20 years, we want to be carbon neutral. SmartWool's goal is to be 100% climate positive, not just neutral, which is impressive in and of itself to me. And their goals are not 50%, 60%, 70% regenerative and renewable and blah, blah, blah. Their goal is 100% regenerative, recycled. And they're also part of the responsible packaging movement, which seeks to remove poly bags from like the outdoor fashion industry, if you will. And specifically, their commitment is to remove single-use plastics from their packaging by 2025, which I don't know if you know, that's less than 2 years from now. So hearing goals that are within the next couple years feels so tangible, and to know that they're ahead of most of the goals that they've set really like makes me feel good about what they're doing. But now that we've talked about these different parts of the supply chain, and now they finally decided that it's time to take a look at their end of life of their products and how they can make that part of the supply chain more sustainable. Socks are not really one of those textiles that you buy secondhand, right? I've never bought a pair of socks secondhand. Let me know in the comments if you have. But I think it's really important for a clothing company like SmartWool, who focuses on socks, to create a recycling program, because it's not really something that you would sell or buy secondhand. So this is a problem that really needed to be addressed. And to answer one of the most common questions I got on my Instagram reel about this, yes, this program that SmartWool started, you can recycle any socks. Any socks you can send in for recycling. And the way it works is sometimes you can drop off your socks at a retailer. So they'll have these like boxes specifically at your local retailers. You can look on their website and find which one is near you, but you can just drop your socks off. Boom, simple, easy. If you make a purchase on SmartWool's website, you can get a free poly mailer, like they'll give it to you. You can put your socks in there, send it back. You can also get a free label on smartwool.com, put it on any package you have. So this partnership with Materials Returns, those socks are going to the facility where they're gonna be separated first by hand. This facility specifically focuses on recycling materials, which just made my supply chain nerd heart explode. I can't tell you how exciting it was to be able to get to go there. So they are taking their socks out to be recycled back into their own socks. The other socks get recycled into other things. Now, once SmartWool socks are separated from the other socks, they will then break it down, and it's turned into something called shoddy, which I actually learned after being there is where the name shoddy comes from, because it's just like this roughly ground up material. After it's broken down like that, it goes through a waterless process. They get spun into what looks like really thick yarn. I wouldn't necessarily call it a thread. But then those really thick pieces of yarn do eventually get spun into thread and then shipped over to their actual manufacturing facility, which I also got to visit. Mind blowing once again. And then that thread is just spun into a sock like normal, like magic. And at the end of the day, getting to go behind the scenes, I honestly couldn't find anything, any like problems with this system, like with this program. I was just thoroughly very, very impressed. This video I posted on Instagram kind of caught the algorithm and went on to the other side of the internet who not my audience, right? A new part of the internet. And interestingly enough, one of the comments that I got most commonly was, why would I give my socks back to them for free? And it's interesting because at that point, if you're donating your socks because you want them to be recycled, assuming they're no longer wearable, really, right? Like you've worn them for years, SmartWool makes a really high quality sock. So if you're at the point of needing to recycle your SmartWool sock, it's probably not of much value to you, the consumer, at that time. And what I learned is that actually recycling clothing properly is not cheap and it's not easy. In SmartWool's case, because they're taking responsibility for their environmental impact, and I'm sure for the first several years of a program like this, they just eat the cost of it because it's the right thing to do. These programs are not like, I'm getting your old dirty socks back and this is gonna be a huge moneymaker for us. The point of a recycling program is instead of throwing your stuff in landfill, you can send them to us so they don't end up in landfill. But there's a gap there for sure in the education of the consumer base, which I found really interesting and would love your perspective on. And then one of the other questions I got a lot was, well, are the socks washed? Like, because the manufacturing process is waterless, at least the turning the shoddy into the like wide yarn that I talked about, that's a waterless process. The socks, and I think this is true for all of SmartWool supply chain actually, they're washed after they're created. So the sock gets spit out by that machine and then later they use these like incredible industrial washers to wash the socks at that point. So all in all, when we talk about clothing recycling and then we separately talk about SmartWool's clothing recycling program, I think it's really important to realize that what SmartWool is doing is taking their product and turning it back into a product. But it just made my little supply chain nerd heart so happy to see these socks go from socks to socks in like 2 days. Now, I'm not saying that like recycling clothing is bad instead of turning it into insulation or rags and those sort of things that clothing recycling sometimes gets turned into. I'm not saying that's a bad system because it's obviously better than clothing just ending up in landfills and then we're sourcing materials for insulation and rags and those sort of things. That system that is not circular is not sustainable long term in a literal sense. Let's hold that criticism for the brands who aren't doing what they can. Let's hold that criticism to the brands who don't have sustainability goals, who haven't already improved their supply chains, who haven't found every other way to improve their business and then start a recycling program. Let's give that energy to those just not doing enough. You know what I mean? This is a type of content that like really gets me going. Talking about sustainability from a holistic approach and not just from a recycling, zero waste, plastic, that sort of approach. So if you want to see more videos like this, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to give this video a like. Thanks to SmartWool for sponsoring. And remember, until next time, you cannot do all the good that the world needs, but the world needs all the good that you can do. Bye, guys.